Okay, so I'm going to go through the Passion of Mark and compare the Passion of Mark to the Passion of Matthew. Um, it's fairly long, of course, two fairly long chapters, so I'm not going to be able to look at everything in super great detail, but I'm just going to hit what I consider to be the highlights. Um, the first unit is just the introduction unit, and again, in the Greek, Mark, and the way he says this, where my translation says it was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. No, the Greek is a lot more awkward than this. Mark basically says it was after 2 days the Passion. Okay, the Passion or the Passover was after 2 more days. Okay, which is awkward. Matthew has Jesus say it in a little bit more refined way, where it makes a little bit more less ambiguous sense of what's being said there. Again, there's no doubt about what it means. It's just a question of the expression of the Greek, and so it comes out a little bit better. The rest of the passage is pretty similar. We do notice one thing that's interesting. Caiaphas is mentioned by name in Matthew 26:3. Why is that? I'm not sure, but I have a theory, and we're going to talk about it in another pericope in which he's mentioned later. Okay, now as we go on here, the traitor of Judas is identified, and Jesus then also gives the final instructions for the Passover. Again, high levels of similarity between Matthew and Mark on this. One key difference here, where Judas only speaks of money as the motivation, or not speaks of, but Judas is motivated by money in the abstract sense in Mark. Explicitly, Matthew tells us that it's 30 pieces of silver. And some people will say, well, that's because Matthew's a tax collector, so he always knows the correct amounts. And yeah, maybe that's true. But the other thing about the 30 pieces of silver is it explicitly connects this story to the Old Testament at several points. 30 pieces of silver actually is almost a cliche. It's the price of a slave given in Exodus. It's mentioned in Isaiah. It's mentioned in Jeremiah and in Zechariah as well as being a key amount of money in the lives of those prophets and the oracles of those prophets. So again, this is one more way in which Matthew connects Jesus more explicitly to the Old Testament. We've grown to expect that. The other thing that's interesting is that the Passover preparation instructions in Matthew are much, much more streamlined than they are in Mark. In Mark, they're sufficiently detailed so that you almost get the idea that Jesus really did plan this out in advance. Like, he spoke to a man, there was effectively a coded response by which the disciples would know who the man is and, how they were to identify where the room was to be had. So all these arrangements were made in advance. Mark is quite a bit more vivid in that way. Matthew, the details are so scant that you almost are left to think, well, maybe what Matthew wants us to see is Jesus' supernatural knowledge of who this man is and how he will lead the disciples to the upper room where the Passover is to take place. Okay, so in the next unit, they're celebrating the Passover. Again, the words of institution are almost identical from Matthew to Mark. The key difference here is that the blood of the covenant is to be poured out, and Matthew tells us explicitly this is for the forgiveness of sins. Okay, so this is a little bit more developed soteriologically than Mark is in this regard. And we're going to point out later that this theme of blood and righteousness in general and the connection of forgiveness of sins is actually a motif that Matthew has been building up to. And I think this is his way of drawing the Lord's Supper celebration into that. And indeed, how the celebration of the Eucharist is to be connected to this idea of forgiveness. Heading on and down along, the aftermath of the Passover celebration. Oops, didn't mean to do that. The prediction of Peter's denial. The main difference here is, again, Mark has this awkward detail that the cock is to crow 2 times before Peter is to give his 3 denials, whereas Matthew leaves that detail out. Okay, so in the interest of time, I've skipped over the Gethsemane account. There's not too many differences there between Matthew and Mark. And again, I should say that if I'm skipping over these stories and only highlighting big things, keep in mind at the small level, looking at little grammatical and verbal changes, there are many differences in all likelihood, and so take with a grain of salt if I say that they're not significant. I'm only simply saying that they're not significant enough for me to spend time in this video going through them, but they probably would be very significant if you were to look at it closely. And so don't assume that the minor details are not significant also. Okay, so this is the story of the arrest of Jesus in Gethsemane. Again, very, very similar, except in the Matthean account, there's a reference to the ability of the Lord to appeal to his Father to send angels. That's something that Mark doesn't have. There's also an extra reference to the prophetic fulfillment, which comes up once in Mark, but is mentioned a couple of times in the Matthean account. Excuse me. And then also, In the Matthean account, you do have this unusual story of the naked man running away, which is one of the few elements of Mark's gospel that Matthew chooses to exclude entirely. And those are the 2 verses at the end of the unit in Mark 14:50. Mark 14:51 and Mark 14:52. Okay, so we work our way to the trial. So-called trial before the Sanhedrin. Again, Jesus is led to the high priest. Matthew names him by name, Caiaphas. Why Caiaphas? Why is Caiaphas mentioned by name? I think Caiaphas is mentioned also in the Gospel of John, but he's not mentioned in Mark, nor is he mentioned in Luke. Interesting speculation, and I don't know if it is true, but I totally want it to be true. Some people think that this is a play on words with Peter's Aramaic name, Cephas, as though the old Caiaphas is the false religious leader of the people to be replaced by this new leader, Cephas. Again, I don't think Matthew gives us a whole lot of reason to believe that he's thinking it, but boy, that would be really neat if he was. One other difference that's interesting in the trial itself, in Mark's version, Jesus is accused of saying that he would destroy the temple that is made with hands and in 3 days build another not made with hands. But it's explicitly told to us as false testimony because the witnesses can't agree. Okay? Now what's interesting is that Matthew takes that phrase, charge, and massages it a little bit. In the Matthean version, the charge is that this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. Okay, so the oracle is a little bit more concise. It's more about ability rather than explicit prediction. And furthermore, there are 2 that come forward to do this. And so under the law, I mean, that would be valid testimony if 2 witnesses could agree. What's very interesting is that Matthew really seems to be a little bit more willing than Mark to let us believe that this is something that Jesus actually prophesied. Okay, not only prophesying the temple destruction in the abstract, but that he himself would have some sort of agency associated with it. Why is the Matthean version of this more favorable to the view that the readers of Matthew might be inclined to think Jesus really did make this claim, whereas in Mark they didn't. It may well simply be that by the time Matthew is being written, the temple actually already is destroyed. And in this sort of scenario, it's easier to imagine Matthew being more comfortable with actually explicitly connecting Jesus to these words, maybe not by direct agency, but by, effectively implied agency that Jesus really could have done it and maybe did in fact have something to do with it. That's speculation on my part, but I think that's as good an explanation as I've seen on why the accounts are different in this regard. Okay, we move on down to the next unit of the trial, that Jesus is still on trial before the high priest. They get really to the point of the trial where Jesus is now explicitly asked to affirm or deny that he is the Christ, the Son of the Blessed. It's interesting, in Mark's version, Jesus explicitly says, "I am," and what he says afterwards concerning the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven, is almost exactly how Matthew quotes him, except that Jesus doesn't say, "I am," ego eimi. He says, "You have said so." And there's of course a long, detailed discussion among interpreters for many, many centuries about how this should be understood. Does "you have said so," does that mean exactly the same as "I am"? Does it mean you've got that right? Or is it a little bit more equivocal? Does it mean to say, well, that's what you're saying, but that's not really necessarily what I'm saying? Or is it simply just a way of Jesus distancing himself from the idea of being a Messiah in the way that they think a Messiah should be? In other words, he thinks he's the Messiah, they think he might be the Messiah, but their idea of Messiah is wrong, and so therefore if they ask him that he's the Messiah, he doesn't really want to come out and say, "Yes, I am," but your idea of the Messiah is wrong. It's more like, well, you said so. And in other words, kind of being enough equivocal enough that their own understanding of the Messiah is thrown in doubt, and his own acceptance of the title is really in some way made contingent on a proper understanding of what a Messiah really is. That's in some way part of the dispute anyway. At any rate, in both Mark and Matthew, the response is the same. The high priest tears his garments and exclaims blasphemy. Why is it blasphemy, by the way? That's a fascinating discussion as well. Claiming to be God is one thing. Claiming to be the Messiah is another thing. Claiming to be the Messiah falsely, is that blasphemy? Perhaps. Maybe so, but why would that be considered blasphemy? Or is it really the Daniel quotation where he says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven"? Some people have argued that this strain of Daniel, the interpretation of the book of Daniel, that's a quote from Daniel chapter 7, or at least an allusion to that passage, that in effect the Son of Man figure is deigned to share the throne with God himself, and therefore is taking on God divine honors to himself. And that, if that's the case, that would explain the blasphemy charge, but that is an interpretation. So interestingly enough, they spit in his face, they strike him. Mark has the ironic phrase, prophesied. Of course, prophesy in this case is ironic because Jesus, of course, had prophesied that his tormentors and the chief priests and their servants would strike him. But interestingly enough, Matthew adds the part, prophesy to us, prophesy Christ, who is it that struck you? Okay, so continuing on, we now move into the three Peter denials. They're all compressed by Mark and Matthew into one unit explicitly after his guilt is ascertained by the Sanhedrin. They're very similar with each other, by the way, except there are a couple of elements in Matthew. We mentioned before in the class, Peter explicitly denies Jesus with an oath, which of course places him not only as being a denier of his Lord and Master, but a violator of Jesus' moral precepts in the Sermon on the Mount, in which he told his followers not to take oaths. And continuing on, Peter invokes a curse. My translation says a curse on himself. There is no on himself in the Greek. He invoked a curse, and he swore, "I do not know the man." Many scholars, including me, think that what Peter is doing is cursing Jesus, in effect, to distance himself from the man, to show himself completely separate and unconnected from him. At this point, Mark mentions the cock has crowed twice. It's very interesting in Mark. There's a lot of confusion in the Markan version, because in some versions of Mark, there's another cock crow in the middle of the trial, and so there's some confusion of that. But of course, the cock crows only once in Matthew. Okay, I'm going to skip over the delivery to Pilate. One big element, major addition to the story, is the story of Judas' betrayal. Is the sort of backstory of this. The expression of Judas's claim that he's betrayed innocent blood. This Ima Dikaios is something that was mentioned all the way back by Jesus in Matthew 23, when he was doing his woe oracles and connecting his persecutors and the scribes and Pharisees to those people who have murdered the innocent blood of the prophets. This, of course, places Judas in continuity with those wicked people. Judas acknowledges that he's betrayed innocent blood, and then the field of blood has been prepared, and this is, of course, what the chief priests do with the 30 pieces of silver that Judas gives back to them out of his despair. And this fulfills the prophet Jeremiah, and there's a whole story of the buying of the potter's field in Jeremiah. You can look it up. It's an interesting account. And I'm going to move down here just a bit. Okay, now in the trial before Pilate, again, these are very similar accounts. Matthew has a curious, what looks like to be an addition to Mark. And this is the name of the prisoner who Pilate suggests releasing in exchange instead of Jesus, and this is Barabbas. Except in some versions of Matthew, they're mostly later ones, but we have attestation from several church fathers, including Origen, that this is actually a very ancient variant, where the prisoner's name was not simply Barabbas, but Jesus Barabbas, Jesu Barabbas. So in other words, Barabbas is the Aramaic for son of the Father. So we have here Jesus, the Son of the Father, and Jesus, the Son of God the Father. You have two people with very similar names, and there's an interchange between the two of them. Okay, one's the fake Jesus, Barabbas. One's the true Jesus, Son of God the Father. Very interesting play by Matthew, but one in which was too much to swallow in all likelihood for the scribes who were copying this down and did not want Jesus to share a name with anyone else in the New Testament, least of all the robber Barabbas. So you don't find that in many variants, but it is definitely a variant in some versions, and some scholars are. There's actually, I think, a very good argument that it could be that it's original to Matthew, especially in verse 27:17, where Matthew's version says, "So they had gathered, and Pilate said to them, 'Who do you want me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, I've moved it down a little bit here so you can see they're very similar. Mark and Matthew are up to the point of which the decision is made to crucify Jesus and release Barabbas. Okay, but Matthew adds a very famous little unit here, which relates to other elements of Matthew's gospel in several ways. Okay, this is where Pilate says in chapter 27, verse 24 of Matthew, when Pilate saw he was gaining nothing, but rather a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, famously saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. So you see again this theme of blood and blood guilt and blood innocence. This is again, the word innocent is in the Greek the same word as righteous. So when Jesus speaks of the righteous blood mentioned before, this harks back to his woe oracles against the scribes and the Pharisees. So you see here Jesus now explicitly stands in continuity with the prophets of old who were murdered unjustly by the religious authorities. And what's more, an explicit recognition of his innocent blood and his so standing by a Gentile ruler, which is not something you would expect. Okay, and so that's interesting as well. And then, of course, you go on and you have... Oh, I should point out, of course, that the reason Pilate perhaps comes to that understanding is because of his wife's dream, which is another element that Matthew alone features. And this goes back to the top. This is where Pilate's wife mentions him and says that word to him have nothing to do with that righteous man. Again, the word righteous, the word innocent, same word dikaios in the Greek. I have suffered much over him today in a dream. So this not only connects Jesus to the innocent blood of the prophets, going all the way back to Abel, which Jesus mentions in that powerful woe oracle, summing up the woes in chapter 23, but also it's a dream in which Jesus' true nature is revealed to a character in the story. And of course, we have grown to be familiar with Matthew, using certain inclusio, that is, repeating elements that began the story. And if you remember, Joseph himself had a dream, or was warned in a dream, at least on 3 different occasions concerning Jesus or what should be done with Jesus, and you see the same now with Pilate's wife. Okay, I'm going to pass over the Simon of Cyrene story because that's very similar from Mark to Matthew, except to note that Mark mentions Simon's children, and no one can come up with a good reason of why Mark should make that mention, except what I think is the overwhelming likelihood is that those 2 men, Alexander and Rufus, who Mark mentions, are in fact, by the time Mark was writing this, well-known followers of Jesus who were the real storytellers, the chief tridents of this story, who would protect this story and tell it repeatedly as their own sort of family lore of their dad's brush with greatness here by accident, being at the right place at the right time. The scene of death is very similar from Mark to Matthew. Again, the details are almost identical. The cry from the cross is a little bit different. In Mark, Eloi, Eloi is a little bit closer to Aramaic, whereas Eli, Eli is a little bit closer to Hebrew in Matthew's version, what Jesus cries. Other than that, they're very similar. There's not a whole lot of difference here between them that I can see, at least looking at it cursorily. But there is a very important difference that you get to when Jesus dies, and I'm going to scroll down here to show you that. You see in Mark, we're told that the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Okay, but Matthew goes much further and tells us that not only was the curtain of the temple torn in 2, but that the earth shook, the rocks were split, The tombs were also open, and many of the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised and had come out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection. So we're telling a story dyschronologized here because Jesus is just died. He hasn't risen from the dead yet, but this is clearly a later insertion. And then they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Okay, so wow, what is that all about? Well, many things, but I think it has to do with the idea of sort of a mini little resurrection. Remember, Jesus rise from the dead. This is not the whole story, but there's a connection to the rising and the vindication of all the just people who've died in God, in God's friendship. The clear vindication of their death, their righteous death, by their ultimate vindication, just like the Maccabees. So this again goes back to the innocent blood that was shed throughout many centuries. From Jesus's rhetoric, from Abel all the way to Zechariah the son of Berechiah. So this is interesting, but it's also it's eschatological. So it really draws out the resurrection of Jesus in connection to the resurrection of the saints. This is a very strong witness to Matthew's belief in not only the general resurrection, but again connecting Jesus' resurrection to the resurrection of those who have fallen asleep. A connection that Paul himself will also make, as will other New Testament writers. And I think it's also eschatological in another way, in that those who fall asleep, where do they go? They go into the holy city, which is, of course, Jerusalem. And what do? They appear to many. Who are the ones they appear to? And what do they do with this appearance? I take it to be, in the context of this, a very grisly sort of a warning to those who have, implicitly gone along with the judgment of the Pharisees and the scribes in putting to death this righteous man. In other words, they are there to witness against those who have, in effect, filled up the measure of their father's sins. And this is, I think, the key in Matthew's eschatology. This is another key element that we see often in his gospel. Now, the remainder of the story with the centurion confessing Jesus as the Son of God, the effect of this is a little bit blunted by I think the insertion of this other story. It's a little bit more dramatic in Mark, when none of the human characters in Mark ever confess Jesus to be Son of God. Even in Peter's confession in Mark's story that Jesus was only the Christ, he didn't get the Son of God part. So no human character had confessed Jesus to be Son of God until you get this centurion at his death. So there's a little bit of drama there that Matthew, I think, kind of blunts, but I think Matthew gives us more than enough drama in exchange when he tells us this fascinating story of the rising of the saints in a sort of a proto-resurrection. So what can we say in general about this now that we've compared Matthew and Mark? They're very similar, okay, but I think a very good analogy is to think of Mark as kind of a diamond, and maybe the diamond is in somewhat of a rough setting. The diamond certainly has elements of sparkle and glitter, but when Matthew takes it and adds just really a relatively few number of elements, major additions, the diamond in its new setting really shines much more brightly in some respects than it had before. We see that Matthew really has a much more heightened and defined soteriology than Mark had. Matthew really is explicitly connecting Jesus' blood not only to Israel's history and the righteous blood shed in the past, but also to God's explicit vindication of those who have died through the shedding of righteous blood, the martyrs, and how they will be vindicated. And also the shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sins. So in other words, how the shedding of blood actually works. It's not simply a condemnation, but it really offers the real hope of forgiveness. And that's really brought out in Jesus' own words, unique words in the words of institution, where the blood of the covenant is for the forgiveness of sins. That's an element that only comes in Matthew. There's also a more heightened eschatology in Matthew as well. This idea of Jesus' dying is drawn out in much more finer eschatological framework. It's going to have earth-shattering, literally earth-shaking implications. There is, in fact, an earthquake. There's a hint of the destruction of the temple with the tearing of the curtain in Mark, but again, there's a lot more signs here, and this is also going to be the trigger, Jesus' death and his own resurrection will of the resurrection of the saints, and indeed the ultimate separation of what Jesus in Matthew has preached many times, as did John the Baptist, of the ultimate separation from the just and the unjust, from the sheep and the goats, from the wheat and the tares, from the good fish and the bad fish, and the righteous and the unrighteous. So it's really clear that Mark's gospel is more developed theologically on many of these areas than Matthew's is more developed than Mark, but there's still a lot in Mark. But you can see that even with a relatively small number of changes, that we can see an awful lot that Matthew has done with the story that simply brings Mark account into greater focus, and also little things as well, like Peter's betrayal, sort of taking on a more definite moral character through his explicit violation of Jesus's commands earlier on. The importance of dreams and the possibility of dreams to reveal things to characters who don't fully know Jesus yet. We saw that back in the infancy narrative when Joseph was not aware yet of Jesus and learned about him through a dream. The same with Pilate and his wife. The hinting in this story of that there is one tradition. It's not a church teaching, but that Pilate and his wife became disciples. So certainly Matthew would lend support for that idea because of how he portrays both Pilate and his wife in this regard. And so there is also this little hint of the so-called replacement theology, where the rulers, the scribes and the Pharisees, the Caiaphases, who have set themselves up against Jesus, have so utterly discredited themselves and placed themselves against the God who they are ostensibly serving, that they're going to be replaced with new followers and new children of God, whom God is able, of course, to raise up from very stones. But just as the wicked tenants parable has told us, that there'll be this replacement taking place. Okay, so enjoy. I hope that helped, and that brings out a lot for you in the passion narrative of Matthew and the passion narrative of Mark.